Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The U.S. is awaiting a response from Iran, and we're waiting to hear from President Trump. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington. We're at the White House right now. Trump is meeting behind closed doors with the Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and they are expected to answer questions from press. At least we think they will, and Iran likely on the agenda. We'll get more from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall coming up in just a moment and be joined for analysis by our political panel, as well as Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute. And there's the economic and political consequences of the ongoing conflict to consider as well, and we'll get into that with the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, in just a few moments, where we expect, at some point, we think, the press will be let into the room for a conversation, some questions and answers with President Trump and the Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is in town for this meeting with the president. They've been meeting behind closed doors for some time, and we knew that there was a lot of issues that these two had to discuss, including trade and tariffs, the relationship with China as well, considering that Brazil, of course, is a member of BRICS, and President Trump has a trip planned to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping next week. And then there's the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and the war with Iran to consider, something that Lula has been highly critical of, and also critical of another aspect of the president's foreign policy agenda in the raid of Nicolas Maduro, the capture of him in Venezuela. So we don't have a sense yet as to how this meeting is going. Perhaps we'll get some revealing answers from them if and when they do speak to the White House press corps. But as we await that, we turn now to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, our Washington correspondent, who is here with me in our D.C. studio. So, Tyler, we know that there's a lot they could discuss. I would imagine, though, that this is happening against the backdrop of a U.S. that is actively waiting right now a response from Iran to its latest peace proposal that Iran is probably featuring pretty highly in terms of what is front of mind. Do we have a sense of when we expect Iran to respond? The president yesterday indicated it was going to be, 24 to 48 hours?
Well, and that's what at least one person familiar with the matter tells Bloomberg News, that it could come within the next day, as this White House maintains that a deal will get done. But at least publicly, the sides still appear to be pretty far apart, particularly when it comes to whether or not we'll see any movement around Iran's nuclear capabilities. And at the moment, perhaps the most pressing contentious issue, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, remains a very fragile situation. CNN had reported a couple of hours ago that Iran had released these new rules for vessels that they have to meet in order to transit through the strait, including answering up to 40 questions via email about their vessels before they're allowed to go through, as the U.S. maintains that its naval blockade is still in full force. Just yesterday, CENTCOM had confirmed that the U.S. military intercepted an Iranian-linked oil tanker that was trying to move through the Gulf of Oman to and from different Iranian ports. So it's very clear that the pressure campaign is still there, though we have seen the White House really message around this idea that right now they only want to take a defensive posture, that they want to bring Iran to the negotiating table, though, of course, we also heard Kailey from President Trump yesterday threatening to restart military operations if the deal doesn't go as planned. So we'll have to see where that lands.
Yeah, the bombing, he threatened, could resume, although I guess one could argue the president has to maintain that threat there if he wants Iran to be able to play ball here. How much, in terms of timing and the push for a diplomatic resolution, is being driven by what's on the president's agenda next week, a planned trip to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping? He wants to have some kind of resolution by that meeting, right?
I mean, he told reporters basically that much. He said yesterday that he thinks there's a, quote, very good chance that we could see an agreement before he sits down with China's President Xi Jinping. Just yesterday, we saw Iran's foreign minister visit Beijing for the first time since the conflict began. And we heard some pretty relatively tough words from China, saying that it would be unadvisable to keep the conflict going. We know China wants a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And the sanctions question could also maybe complicate President Trump's dialogue with the Chinese president, though earlier today, Bloomberg News had some pretty incredible reporting that China's main financial regulator actually instructed banks for now to temporarily suspend new loans to these oil refiners that have been sanctioned by the U.S. over ties to Iranian crude, which appears to reverse what was previous guidance from last week that seemed to go against U.S. sanctions. So maybe there's some sort of movement there, but there's a lot to track when it comes to his visit next week. But even as the administration wants it to be about economic ties, no doubt the conflict in Iran is going to dominate the conversation.
Well, and the conversation with Lula as well, I would imagine. Tyler, do we have a sense of what the White House wants from this visit, or is it more about what Brazil is hoping to achieve with this visit to Washington?
It feels maybe more like the latter. This, of course, caps what has been months of ups and downs between these two leaders. We can confirm that the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, as well as the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, are in the room. You were talking about it just last hour on this program. Economic ties are going to feature very prominently here. Brazil was perhaps the most targeted with tariffs at one point, up to 50% by President Trump, but then also perhaps benefited the most when the Supreme Court struck down the emergency authority. So we'll be watching for any sort of movement there. We know that the two countries have been trying to get a critical minerals deal over the finish line, but of course there's domestic pressure in Brazil. So maybe that will factor into the conversation as well.
Yeah, of course, those high tariffs that they were facing were because President Trump was unsatisfied with the treatment of Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro. And I wonder how Lula might field questions about that. We do still expect they are going to speak to press, right? This is an unusual cadence in terms of the way these foreign leaders' White House visits usually go.
So as of now, we still do. We're not going to read too much into this. It is very delayed. Press was supposed to be let into the room at 11:15 a.m. Eastern. We're now 10 minutes past 1 p.m. Eastern. There is reporting that they have started the lunch portion. Typically, the press is let in for a public spray. Then they have dialogue behind closed doors. Then they have a working lunch where the leaders are met with the rest of their teams to talk out maybe some other technical details if they do want to announce any agreements. Feels like we're going in reverse here. It is our understanding that bilat has ended. They're moving to a working lunch, so we'll have to wait and see. But it doesn't feel like reporters are getting in any time soon.
And we wait, and we wait. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, our Washington correspondent, thank you so much. And of course, as we wait remarks from Trump and Lula, we also are waiting, as we've mentioned, for a response from Iran and for further clarity as to whether or not this conflict is getting closer to its end. So how should we consider this politically? Let's pose that question to former Republican congressman from North Carolina, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry. He, of course, is a Bloomberg politics contributor. Now, always good to see you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I wonder, as we see this administration pushing clearly very hard for a diplomatic resolution here, is if you see that as mostly being politically driven rather than strategically driven, and what the strategic outcomes need to be in order for the administration to be able to sell to the American electorate that this whole thing was worth it in the first place.
Well, there are a couple conflicting issues here. You have domestic politics, where clearly the president is on the hot seat with rising oil prices and the impact on daily lives as a result of the Iranian conflict. There's the international piece, which is regional, largely with Iran and its neighbors, and whether or not we can come to a satisfactory resolution here, open the strait, and return to Middle Eastern normal for the movement of commodities. Then the third element, which you mentioned in the last reporting here, and Bloomberg's done a great job of highlighting this, which is the meeting with Xi and the impact of Iran on and Iranian oil in particular on the cost of everything in China and China's dependency on the Iranian regime and China's funding and military and technological support of the Iranian regime. So there's a threefold set of things here that are live, real, and quite impactful, and require a matter of nimbleness by the administration to handle that. Like we saw from Marco Rubio at the podium the other day, it's going to be a complicated outcome here.
Well, of course, Marco Rubio at that podium was trying to sell Project Freedom, which has now been on pause, why it was necessary to have this defensive, what he described as a rescue effort in the Strait of Hormuz. But your former colleagues also have to defend this in their own way, maybe not at podiums, but in town halls, on the trail as they fight to keep their seats in November. How what do they need to be able to say was accomplished in order to make the case to their constituents that the blood and treasure spent, the higher gas prices that they've been facing now for months, was ultimately worth it? I just wonder what politically, ahead of the midterms, is kind of the minimum bar here.
Well, the minimum bar has not yet been met because we've not talked about the impact of the Iranian regime over the last 25 years, over the last 50 years nearly. The blood that they've let, the attacks that they've instigated, that they have funded on American troops in the Middle East and their neighbors and globally. They're one of the greatest funders of terror in the world. In the 80s, 90s, and through just this year, in fact. That is a changed thing now that that regime is gone, number one. Number two, it is no longer an offensive weapon to harm their neighbors or the rest of the world. They cannot fund outside their own dire needs internally for their economy. Those things need to be talked about what the regime was, and that storytelling has not been part of the administration's talk track, if you will. They need to highlight that, and policymakers on the Hill need to do a better job of talking about the impact of Iran and the impact it's had on destabilizing the Middle East and funding terror in the world. Now, that is one component of it. And then what is the benefit with a changed Iranian regime? What do we bring to the world? Greater stability. Pulling over somebody who has been on our opponent's side of providing them oil, natural resources, and funding, and now could be at best a neutral party. Maybe slightly better than that, but at best, I think hope is to be a neutral party in the world. That is a massive change in the order of the world that the president's brought about in just a short order of time.
Well, it's important to consider, of course, that massive change has brought with it higher gasoline prices, which we've often talked about as being detrimental to the Republicans as the incumbent majority heading into November. To what extent, though, will Republicans be able to offset that negative impact by carving out potentially more safe red districts for themselves via a redistricting war that seems like, while it was reaching an end, a Supreme Court decision may extend even further?
Well, first, gas prices, the cost of living, huge issue for the midterms. That is going against the incumbent party, which is the Republican Party. And the midterms are going to be hard for Republicans, generally because they're the party in power, but specifically because of the cost of living. Now, the question of redistricting is a countervailing force to that movement against Republicans. There are more Republican-controlled states. There are more Democratic gerrymandered districts, and the Supreme Court has ruled that there are now very few rules governing redistricting at the state level. That means that you have additional Republican states trying to carve up additional districts that could benefit Republicans. Florida, just last week, bring at least 4 new Republican districts out of that state. What we have now is a much more competitive landscape, even if the environment's bad for Republicans. That gives Republicans the opportunity to keep the U.S. House. That means that we have a very, very different midterm election, not assured for Hakeem Jeffries to become Speaker of the House anymore.
Well, I wonder how we're defining safe Republican district here with some of these redraws. I got into this yesterday with Mark Short, who, of course, ran legislative affairs during the first Trump administration, served as Vice President Pence's chief of staff. This is what he told me about this whole thing.
If you're basically watering down solid Republican districts to create more opportunities, you're making them R+4, R+5. If this is a real blue year where you won't be safe in an R+8 or 9 seat, and so actually you might end up losing seats by this grab, and so it seems to me that you might be chasing it in the moment, but come November, this actually could be counterproductive. We're actually making more seats competitive that Democrats could take.
What say you to that, Mr. Chairman?
Well, that is on the pessimistic side, I would say. If you're drawing like the state of Florida did, these districts are roughly 54, 55% or more that President Trump's number in the district. that means that they're more likely to go for the Republican than an R plus 3 or 4, as Mark said. His point there is when you do a narrow gerrymander like that, we call those a dummy mander, right? You think you're being super crafty, and you've just made a competitive seat that will go for Democrats or your opposing party. What you see in most of these states is drawing pretty solid Republican districts. The question is the magnitude of this. If you see a massive movement against Republicans as a result of higher prices, the economic questions that we think are very, very important, Republicans will be punished. And those districts that Republicans won by 3, 4, 5 points in previous elections will be gone. So there's truth in what Mark said yesterday, but the facts of these districts are that they're more Republican than what is the likely sweep against Republicans in the midterm.
And finally, can't let the former House Financial Services chair who fought hard for market structure legislation when it comes to crypto go without asking, are we actually going to see the moment in time now for the Clarity Act? We've had some optimistic conversations on this network this week.
Well, look, if I'm in the prediction markets, I would say that this bill gets signed into law in the month of June or July. And I do think Senator Scott is moving ahead with a markup. He has a coalition of Republicans and hopefully Democrats that will be willing to vote for what is bipartisan policy that we've crafted over the last 7 years that I started 7 years ago in the House of Representatives. So I'm bullish on the opportunity to see sound law, for us to have a permanent new market structure for crypto, and for America to emerge as the crypto capital of the world. Very optimistic.
All right. Well, we'll see if we have another July 4th bill signing for the second year in a row. Patrick McHenry, the former chair of the House Financial Services Committee and now Bloomberg Politics contributor, thank you so much for joining us. And we still have more ahead here on Balance of Power. We'll turn to our political panel next as Marco Rubio is at the Vatican with the Pope. That's ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington, where, yes, we are still waiting to hear from President Trump at the White House in the aftermath of his bilateral meeting with Brazil President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. They have not yet spoken to the press. Of course, if they do so this hour, we will bring you some of those remarks here on Bloomberg TV and radio, expecting, of course, that President Trump specifically will be fielding questions about the conflict with Iran and the push toward a diplomatic end to it as the U.S. awaits Iran's response to its latest peace proposal. But in the diplomacy realm, the chief diplomat of the United States, Marco Rubio, isn't so much focused on the Middle East and Iran directly today, though I'm sure it did come up where he was at the Vatican with Pope Leo. Rubio, of course, being a Catholic himself, perhaps dispatched to do a little bit of cleanup in the aftermath of a very public clash between the Pope and President Trump in recent weeks. And when we heard from Marco Rubio in the press briefing, where he was at the podium earlier this week fielding a number of questions from reporters, he did give us a preview of this trip.
It's a trip we had planned from before, and obviously we had some stuff that happened. And no, look, there's a lot to talk about with the Vatican. I'll give you one example. The Pope just returned from a trip to Africa, where the church is growing very vibrantly. And we have shared concerns about religious freedom, freedom in different parts of the world. We'd love to talk to them about that. The topic of Cuba, we gave Cuba $6 million of humanitarian aid, but obviously they won't let us distribute it. We distributed it through the church. We'd like to do more. We're willing to give more humanitarian aid to Cuba, by the way, distributed through the church, but the Cuban regime has to allow us to do it. They won't allow us to give their own people more humanitarian aid, and we're willing to do it through the church. So there's a lot to talk about.
In terms of what they did talk about, we got a readout from the State Department that reads in part, the meeting underscored the strong relationship between the United States and the Holy See and their shared commitment to promoting peace and human dignity. But is this relationship still as strong given the stuff that happened that Marco Rubio was alluding to? Let's get into this now with our political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are with me. Rick, of course, also a Republican strategist and Stone Court Capital partner. Jeanne, a Democratic analyst and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. So, Rick, obviously, it's not a secret that the president has been critical of the of the Pope, who has been critical of the war with Iran. To what extent was Marco Rubio's job at the Vatican really one of just trying to smooth things over with the leader of the Catholic faith, of which, of course, he subscribes?
Yeah, maybe it would be best called damage control, because not only has Donald Trump been excessively critical of the pontiff, but even his own vice president has tried to school him on liturgy. So, I mean, it's not an administration that has a lot of room to navigate in a positive way with the Vatican or with the Pope. But really, the best possible option would have been to send Marco Rubio, practicing Catholic and a man of faith, and someone who understands the importance of having the Catholic Church supporting some of your initiatives, like the one you just described in Cuba, where we can supply aid to the Cuban people without going through the government, and that would be through the Catholic Church. So there should be some effort to find common ground, but I'm sure right now it's to plug a hole, because Donald Trump's numbers have cratered amongst Catholic voters who supported him in 2024, probably in large part because of the war of words that have been coming from the White House.
Well, so if this is a damage control mission, what does it say to you, Jeanne, that Marco Rubio, yes, a Catholic, was selected for it rather than the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who he himself also is a Catholic and has a book coming out about his return to the Catholic faith, or his finding of the Catholic faith shortly. Is he not a better messenger here?
Not according to the Vatican at this point. When the vice president tried to school the Pope in terms of warning him about how he conducts himself, particularly how he spreads the word, that didn't go over, surprisingly, didn't go over with the Vatican. And so they much prefer Rubio. We understand that the Pope gave Marco Rubio a pen made of wood from an olive tree and said, olive, of course, is a plant of peace. So I do think we are trying to see both sides smooth this thing over. But J.D. Vance has got himself in a host of trouble. Marco Rubio, if you want to think about 2028, is the beneficiary of some of that. But even before 28, we've got 2026. And to Rick's earlier point, Catholics are not happy with how the president has conducted himself, with that picture of himself like suggesting he was like Jesus, which he said, no, he was like a doctor. You had almost 90% of Americans and 90% of Catholics saying that they took umbrage at that. And we've seen other reactions when the president and the administration have criticized the Pope and the Catholic Church, including most recently, just the other day, when Donald Trump suggested that the Pope was endangering Catholics by not supporting the war in Iran. And something, of course, the Pope pushed back on and said, we, of course, always preach peace. So it is something that they are concerned about for the midterm. And certainly this trip today is an indication of that and trying to smooth things over. But of course, with Donald Trump, you can never control what he says after Marco Rubio returns to the U.S.
Well, I would love to keep playing the Rubio versus Vance 2028 game and how we should read into their various appearances this week, including Marco Rubio being at the podium in the press briefing room earlier. But I do want to mention some headlines that just crossed the terminal from the Wall Street Journal, because they are moving the market. The Journal reporting that the U.S. is looking to restart Project Freedom, of course, the maritime effort to get free-flowing trade through the Strait of Hormuz once again via help from the U.S. military, which the president put on pause earlier this week in pursuit of diplomatic negotiations with Iran. The Journal reports they're looking to restart Project Freedom, and importantly, that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have lifted their curbs on the U.S. military's access to the bases. When Project Freedom launched, this was an issue that those curbs were imposed on their bases and airspace, as it seemed that there was a lack of coordination once again amongst allies here potentially. But we are seeing a market reaction to this. Stocks right around session lows. We're down now about 0.5% on the S&P 500, around 73.30 at this time. Oil around session highs. We're up now 2% on WTI, back around $97 a barrel. Brent at $102 a barrel, so firmly in triple digits. Once again, seeing a bit of upward pressure in yields as well as bonds sell off. We're up 4 basis points on the 10-year to just shy of 440. So, Rick, when we consider these headlines, if we're going to restart Project Freedom shortly after we paused it, shortly after it launched in the first place, should we read into this as some kind of signal about potentially a lack of the diplomatic progress the president is hoping for?
Yeah, it's so hard to tell, Kailey, as to what is and isn't affecting the White House's approach to this war. It's really been whiplash of late as to whether or not we're increasing our readiness and planning on further kinetic attacks, or whether we're going into full diplomatic mode and trying to cut a deal. Yeah, I think you would have to assume that the latest announcements would indicate that they're not making the progress they want to make with the Iranian regime, which is not a shock to anybody, except that we keep getting these, other signals from the White House that no, we can cut a deal anytime we want. So yeah, I think that we're in for a ride of our lifetime. Markets have been in turmoil over this since the war began, and just wait till Congress gets back on Monday and has to decide, if we're still in a war with Iran, aren't we going to do something about it in Congress, like a War Powers Act, which they are required to do? So stay tuned.
Well, yeah, we will indeed stay tuned. But of course, the administration argues, and we saw this with President Trump's letter to Congress after we passed the 60-day threshold of when these operations began, that the combat operations are wrapped up, that there's a termination to hostilities. Marco Rubio said earlier this week that Operation Epic Fury is over, and that Project Freedom, which again the Wall Street Journal here is reporting the U.S. could restart as early as this week, is fundamentally a defensive effort, a rescue effort, humanitarian, on behalf of the more than 20,000 crew members aboard these commercial vessels who have been stranded since this conflict began. I just wonder if that is a harder sell for lawmakers facing down November, Jeanne, that there's some kind of distinction here.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. When you look at the letter of the law, it very clearly lays out when the clock stops. And of course, when you have a blockade in place, that is an act of war. You are prohibiting, maybe for very good reason, people from traversing the seas freely. That is an act of war. We shot at an Iranian ship yesterday. That is an act of war. We've got 50,000 troops there. So the idea that we're on some kind of pause doesn't make sense from a legal, from a constitutional, from an originalist perspective. And these are Republicans. I think it's fascinating that they're going or considering putting the Project Freedom blockade, Project Freedom project back in practice, because, of course, it was a huge win for the Iranians when it was called off within 24 hours. Because what did it say? We were saying with Project Freedom that you don't control the Strait, Iran. We will safely escort these ships through. Within hours, we backed off on that. And we didn't hold up to all the bravado that is coming out of Donald Trump's mouth and out of the defense secretary's mouth. And so that was a win, if only because it tells Iran we have the upper hand here. So now we are back at it. And I think this should be very troubling for a market that wants some kind of stability, which is not nearly where we are with the president's back and forth rhetoric. And just one more thing, every time the president says that we are nearing a peace deal, and we've had all these mixed messages, what is heard over Iran, what is heard in Farsi, we understand from people on the ground, is exactly the opposite. Because let's not forget, 2 times in the last year when we have been negotiating in good faith with Iran and the president has said we are near a deal, within hours we have turned around and bombed them. So in fact, in just the last 24 hours, Iran has been telling its own people, beware, things are getting more tense.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, our excellent political panel, reacting to this breaking news. Thank you so much. Again, the Wall Street Journal reporting the U.S. is looking to restart Project Freedom potentially as soon as this week, as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait lift restrictions on use of their air bases and air space as well. Markets reacting, stocks down, oil up. We'll have more next on Bloomberg. Running through the market reaction to the headlines that crossed just moments ago from the Wall Street Journal. I'll reiterate them for our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, that the U.S. is considering restarting Project Freedom, of course, the maritime effort to escort vessels through the Strait of Hormuz safely, as soon as this week, after Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have agreed to lift restrictions that were imposed on the use of military bases and their airspace in order to conduct this operation, this mission, this project, however you want to characterize it. Clearly, the market is reacting negatively to this headline, and I wonder what the reaction is of Evelyn Farkas, the executive director of the McCain Institute, who's joining us now here on Balance of Power. She, of course, is former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Obama administration. Evelyn, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's always great to have you. If we're to see a restart of Project Freedom potentially just, 36 hours after it was paused, just shortly after it was announced in the first place, what does this signal to you?
Well, it signals clearly that the Trump administration wants to get this underway. But I think that there are still potentially obstacles, a lot of risk out there. So, I'd be calling up the insurance companies to find out whether they feel comfortable with the current arrangement. So I feel like there's probably many questions that are still unanswered.
Well, certainly so. And of course, the proposal that we have seen reporting the U.S. has made to Iran around peace remains unanswered. We have yet to hear from Iran. But our basic understanding of what is essentially a short memorandum of understanding, Evelyn, is this notion that they want to prioritize the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and that any kind of definitive deal around the nuclear program might be put off for some time, even as President Trump said Iran has agreed to never have a nuclear weapon, something, of course, Iran has maintained for some time. If that ultimately is where we end up, if we're just back to some kind of moratorium ultimately on Iran's nuclear enrichment, did we achieve much through this entire conflict?
Yeah, Kailey, obviously we didn't have this problem with the Strait of Hormuz before this war that the U.S. and Israel launched against Iran. So that's a new problem that now we're focused on solving as the number one problem, at least according to the headlines. But the reality is the real number one problem is what you said, the Iranian nuclear program. And the reality is that, yes, if they get a moratorium, if they freeze the program and they ban Iran from enriching uranium, that would be a win, clearly, for the United States. But it has come, obviously, at great cost.
Well, I also wonder at the costs the Iranians have been dealt to this point, Evelyn, as we saw reporting in the Washington Post about analysis from the CIA, which was delivered, according to the Post reporting, to administration officials this week that concluded Iran can survive the U.S. naval blockade, which, of course, is still being actively maintained for at least 3 to 4 months before it faces severe economic hardship. So is this really an Iran in a position right now to make great concessions on the nuclear program or anything else? Or do they still have the ability to withstand this for some time and maybe less inclined to make a deal advantageous to the United States?
Yeah, Kailey, they have the ability to bring in this revenue because there's still oil out there that's being sold. Now, after that 3 to 4 month period, they'll have to get new oil out, and that's why they want to work with the United States to open the strait. Having said that, you're right. The Iranians have always dealt this way. They always will draw out the negotiations as much as possible, especially when they're looking at a U.S. administration that seems, almost desperate to want to get on to the next issue. President Trump himself has even talked about Cuba as the next challenge. So, the fact that we seem to want this deal so badly will incentivize, unfortunately, the Iranians to dig in their heels. And as the CIA notes, yes, we have not completely decimated their missile capability, and of course we know their drone capabilities, so they still are formidable, and the regime is more hardline than it was before the war started. So there are all these new challenges, in a sense, that we face, although, make no mistake, Iran is a lot weaker than it was, a year ago.
It's weaker than it was, but is it going to be weak enough for Israel to be satisfied with a deal to end this conflict? As you talk about the ballistic missile program, which, of course, was a grave concern of Netanyahu's, one of the reasons we understand he was pushing President Trump to begin this joint operation in the first place. It obviously feels it has an existential threat if Iran has the capability to one day become nuclear. What's going to be enough to satisfy the other party in this conflict?
No, that's a really good point, Kailey. The Israelis will not be satisfied with the information, at least that we saw coming out of that CIA report about ballistic missile capabilities or stockpiles. The other thing that the Israelis will not feel comfortable about is that this regime, has not indicated that they're willing to give up their support to proxies. And that's actually what's at stake here in the talks that are coming up in Washington between Lebanon and Israel in the United States, which is good because we should be involved and we should be helping the Lebanese government and the Israelis figure out a way to dismantle, or at least the military arm of Hezbollah, if not the political arm. But Iran has indicated no interest in giving up their support, as I said, for the Hezbollah, for the Houthis, and so we can continue to expect problems from those Iranian aspects of their foreign policy as well.
Well, and we're still seeing Israel go after Hezbollah targets. We saw strikes in Beirut that they said were targeting Hezbollah earlier this week. There is still kinetic activity to the northern border for Israel against the backdrop of all of this going on. How quickly could that spill over, I guess, Evelyn, knowing Iran had previously said a precondition to any kind of peace agreement or to coming to the table for talks in the first place was a ceasefire sticking between Israel and Hezbollah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super optimistic about the likelihood of a quick resolution to the problem between Israel and Lebanon in terms of dealing with Hezbollah and southern Lebanon. The Israelis are going to try to insist on a buffer zone, which of course the Lebanese government will view as an affront to their sovereignty. And frankly, domestically, it's really difficult because the Shia people, who are the ones who are obviously under some sway, some Hezbollah sway, but they're also the ones who have been pushed out of those southern areas, so the part of southern Lebanon. So for the Lebanese government, this is a difficult predicament, and they will need the United States support to come up with a good compromise with Israel.
I'd also like to ask you, Evelyn, about what we're expecting to take place a week from now, which is a visit President Trump is planning to make to Beijing to meet with China's President Xi Jinping, and how, knowing that that visit is on the calendar, at least we assume it is, though China has not yet confirmed, which is kind of par for the course for the Chinese when it comes to these things. But how much of what we're seeing play out now in regard to the push for diplomatic resolution of some kind in the Middle East is tied to that summit and President Trump's desire to have at least it somewhat tied up or cleanlier when he makes that trip to China?
Yeah, I mean, I think President Trump understands he will look stronger going to Beijing as a president who has essentially figured out a way to bring the war to an end, because right now the war is ongoing and it's pressuring the Chinese. Of course, we're pressuring the Chinese. And so it's a bone of contention, frankly, between the United States and China. So he would like to, as you say, kind of clear it, dust his hands of it. But it's not going to be that easy. And the Iranians, of course, are not interested in helping President Trump have a good summit meeting with China.
Well, what is China interested in here, Evelyn? We saw the Chinese foreign minister meeting with Iran's foreign minister in Beijing this week, talking about the need to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, urging against a resumption of hostilities. They have an economic stake in this game as well. They're the buyer of 90% of Iran's oil exports. So would you expect that they're going to play a greater role in trying to see this conflict come to some kind of resolution here?
Yeah, so what I could foresee here, Kailey, is that the Chinese probably don't want this resolved before President Trump shows up in Beijing. Why? Because this is leverage for them. They can tell the president, well, Mr. President, President Trump, we can help you end your war in Iran if you do X, Y, or Z. Because remember, the agenda is quite broad that we are having, that we're the agenda for the summit between President Xi and President Trump. So the Chinese government want a lot of concessions out of the United States. One way to get them is to say, we'll help you with this Iran war if you help us. So I think that the Chinese can be helpful, but they're going to be helpful on their terms and on their own timetable.
Well, and I know that the McCain Institute is obviously fresh off the Sedona Forum, which took place in Arizona last weekend. Evelyn, I'm sure you're still recovering from what I'm sure was a very busy few days. But the theme of the forum this year was challenges to American dominance, and I would imagine that the competition and the power struggle with China featured quite heavily in those conversations. What did you hear on the ground?
It did, Kailey. I mean, I think we heard from lawmakers who were there. We had 10 members of Congress and, of course, Arizona's Governor Katie Hobbs present. On the stage, we had members of Congress discussing the challenges posed by China. Clearly, this is going to require bipartisan work, and that really is the underlying, message from our Sedona Forum, is that it can't be a one-party situation. Both parties have to work together on our foreign policy. That's when we have the greatest success, and that's the case with China. We can't cut off trade. We have to trade with them, but we have to restrict their access to critical technology, and we have to make sure we can continue to compete with China where it's really important for us so that we can continue to have trade access. And that, there was a lot of discussion of China's repression as well. We don't want a system like theirs, so we're also interested in making sure that we protect our way of life here in the United States.
And what of the conversation around the challenge posed by Russia and the ongoing war with Ukraine, Evelyn? It's obviously one that has not been able to get as much oxygen with a hot war in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the participants at the Sedona Forum understand that the urgent war, the one that we need and we can bring to an end almost quicker, frankly, or easier in a way, is the one between Russia and Ukraine, because essentially if we put more pressure on Russia and we help Ukraine, Russia is in a weak situation right now, a weak economic and political situation, and so we can prevail. If we prevail in Russia, it will make it easier for us to address the challenges posed by China and Iran, frankly. So there was a lot of discussion about that. And just really the fact that the Ukrainians have been, frankly, the only country that benefited from the war in Iran. And I say that because of their selling the counter-drone technology to the Gulf allies and to the United States.
Yep. Very good point. Evelyn Farkas, great as always to have you, the executive director of the McCain Institute, here with us on Bloomberg, reacting in part to the breaking news reported by the Wall Street Journal earlier this hour that the U.S. as soon as this week could look to restart Project Freedom in the Strait of Hormuz in cooperation, it seems, with the Saudis and Kuwait, which have agreed to lift restrictions on the use of their bases and airspace for those operations. There has been a market reaction to this. We are looking at stocks right now at session lows. We're down about 0.5% on the S&P 500, just above the 7,300 level. Yields around session highs, up 4 basis points on the 10-year to 440 roughly, and oil is a little bit higher on the day. We're back above $100 a barrel on Brent. They'll, of course, have continued coverage of this market for you on Bloomberg Business Week Daily just ahead, and I'll see you for more Balance of Power at 5 p.m. here on Bloomberg TV and radio.